Gathering the Nations with Jessica Arianes.
Shalom and welcome to Gathering the Nations. I'm your host, Jessica Arianes, and tonight I am going to compare the juridical governance of man with Yahuwah's. Now we will start with the trial of Yahusha. There were two systems of authority that had converged during that time. First was the Sanhedrin's judicial authority, and then there was Rome's executive power. Initially, the Sanhedrin condemned Yahusha for blasphemy under the Torah, but then they recast the charge as sedition, branding him an enemy of Rome. And this was done intentionally because they had no executive power. They required that Rome enforce their judgments. Now, at that time, Pilate was the Roman governor who held imperium, which is basically the executive power to either sentence or pardon. However, Pilate's power was not absolute. It was limited and it was derivative. And it was not just granted by Rome to do Rome's will, but we will see that it was also granted by Yahuwah in order to execute Yahuwah's will, who holds ultimate power over man's eternal destiny. In the beginning, death entered creation as the executive force of sin. Yet the word affirms that Yahuwah determines life and death, that he is the one that wounds and heals, that he brings down to Sheol and raises up. Therefore, death is never independent, but exists at the will of his command, very much like Pontius Pilate. This supreme authority is displayed in Yahusha as he declared the power to lay down his life and then take it up again, holding, in fact, the keys of death and Hades. On the other hand, sin functions like judicial authority, pronouncing the verdict of guilt when the law is broken, the strength of sin being the law, while death functions under executive power, by enforcing the verdict of sin, casting judgment as payment. In John 19:11, Yahusha confronts the delusion of power by distinguishing it between the arm of the flesh and Yahuwah's right hand of strength. Pilate held imperium as the Roman governor, prefectus, procurator of Judea. His role was to enforce imperial law, maintain order, and carry out sentences under the executive branch of Rome. When he says in John 19:10, "Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" He's speaking from that executive sphere. His power is the sword of Rome, the coercive enforcement arm of government. Now, the Sanhedrin, comprised of self-appointed Jewish leaders, particularly the chief priests and certain scribes, functioned within a judicial capacity. They did not wield the power to enforce their verdicts under Roman occupation. Instead, they rendered legal judgments under Torah, as well as their own halakhic interpretations to determine guilt. Later, this would be defined as binding and loosing. In Yahusha's trial before them, they declared him guilty of blasphemy. Yet because they lacked the executive power to execute under Roman rule, they had to deliver him to Pilate. When Judea became a Roman province, the Sanhedrin lost the jus gladi, which literally means the right of the sword. They no longer held legal authority to execute capital punishment, which Rome kept in the hands of governors. This is why in John 18:31, the Jewish leaders admit it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. They could still investigate, judge, and declare verdicts under Torah, but without the sword, their judgments had no force unless Rome enforced them. In Matthew 5:30, Yahusha says, "If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off." The Sanhedrin's right hand had become leprous through corruption, leading the nation into sin. Yahuwah thereby effectively cut it off, leaving them to lean on Rome as a prosthetic arm of the flesh. On the other hand, On the other hand, those who receive Yahusha receive the outstretched arm of salvation, Yahuwah's mighty right hand. Now, Euskladi is the right of the sword. This was the naked power of Rome's magistrates to execute judgment and enforce submission, especially through death. The lictors carried the sword as a sign of imperium, the authority to punish and preserve order by fear. But Rome did not stop with civil order. In fact, it veiled its violence in religion. The wooden crux, also known as the cross, that once executed Yahusha was seized by the pontifex as a counterfeit symbol of spiritual authority. Claiming to hold the clavis, or keys, the papal office crowned itself with power over the ecclesia. Thus, the Roman Church became the harlot of empire. It turned the cross into an instrument of control, wielding a spiritual sword through excommunication, coercion, and false claims of binding and loosing. So what Yahusha gave to his true kahal by his name and the seal of the Ruach, Rome hijacked for domination, replacing covenant with contract, spirit with institution, and the keys that loose the kingdom with the keys that bind to Sheol. In Matthew 18:15-20, Yahusha gives his name as the authority by which the assembly judges matters, that is, to render a verdict. In common law, a deed had to be in the principal's name and under his seal for him to be bound. If an agent acts under his own name and seal, he is personally bound. But if he has the seal to execute in the name of the principal is bound. Thus, the seal was proof of whose authority stood behind the instrument. In covenant terms, acting in Yahusha's name is equivalent to signing and sealing under his authority. Without the name, no act can be authenticated or enforced in the heavenly court. Just as a deed or contract lacking the proper title and signature is void, ab initio, having no standing before a magistrate, so too any word, ordinance, or judgment declared apart from the name lacks legal effect before Yahuwah. The name functions as the mark of authenticity that grants judicial authority, the very credential by which heaven recognizes and ratifies an action. So an agent who acts in the name of someone else is to act under their authority as a representative. Both the name and the seal of the principal are required. The name is the mark of judicial authority, while the Ruach is the seal that executes power or renders final verdict. While in the flesh, Yahusha held judicial authority. He came in the name of Yahuwah, and all that he did in his Father's name. Therefore, Yahusha acted in true form of agency. His words and deeds bound Yahuwah as the principal to perform. John 5:43, Yahusha says, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. John 10:25, the works that I do in my Father's name, they prove I am authentic. Again, in John 17:11-12, he says, Sovereign Father, keep through your name those whom you have given to me. While I was with them in the world, I kept them in your name. This means Yahusha's authority was not self-derived, but derived from Yahuwah as his principle. John 6:27, Yahusha is the Son entrusted with everlasting life. After his resurrection, Yahuwah ratifies his name as a name above all other names, to which every knee will bow and every tongue confess. For Yahuwah the Father has sealed him, sphragizo, to authenticate with the signet or private mark, protecting from misappropriation. By extension, Yahusha delegates this judicial authority to his assembly. Because the law and the prophets spoke of him, his name then becomes the seal of authenticity, the legal authority by which heaven confirms and ratifies the decision. In agency law, an agent's acts bind the principal to responsibility only if they are done in the principal's name and within the scope of authority. Yahusha is therefore the true agent of representation, the sent one, acting intra vires, perfectly within the limits of his Father's will. Those who do Yahusha's will are also given the same authority. Matthew 18:20 says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am with them. In contrast, the Sanhedrin acted in the name of their exalted rabbis, as well as in their own name. Rome acted in Caesar's name. Both were counterfeit, with no true authority or power, only in appearance. Matthew 18:15-20 outlines due process in the assembly. Then Yahusha says, "You shall bind on earth as it is bound in heaven, and loose on earth what is loosed in heaven." In rabbinic and covenantal context, to bind is to declare unclean, unlawful, or forbidden. To loose is to declare clean, lawful, or permissible. It was the judicial prerogative of priests and judges to interpret Torah and render verdicts. A believer who acts in Yahusha's name has authentic judicial authority to establish heavenly sanctions on earth. The assembly does not bind or loose in its own authority, like the Sanhedrin or Rome. Rather, they are doing it in Yahusha's name. The Sanhedrin bound Yahusha under the charge of blasphemy, an attempt to forbid salvation, declaring heaven's sanctions unlawful. And instead, they loosed Barabbas, who was charged with sedition against Rome, as well as the murder of Roman soldiers. The Sanhedrin thereby declared his acts permissible and lawful, in which they assumed true salvation would come by way of the sword. Their act fits squarely in the category of binding and loosing, though they did so corruptly, perverting justice. Just as Pilate represented the name of Caesar and the seal of the Imperium, Yahusha's name becomes the authentic mark that opens the scrolls of heaven, and the Ruach is the seal that overrides all earthly courts. So when Yahusha says, "In my name, whatever you bind or loose," he is not speaking of conjuring words, but granting agency authority as a mark of operation. His name functions like the testimonium clause in a deed. It proves the act is not merely the assembly's decision, but the principal's will being executed through those appointed. This judicial authority was given prior to Yahusha's resurrection. However, after his resurrection, Yahusha gives his disciples power from on high. This power is the executive force to either remit sins, that is to release from liability, or to retain sin, which is to hold guilt in place. This carries an executive enforcement quality, executing judgment or pardoning. Now, in John 20:22, when Yahusha breathes upon his elect, saying, "Receive the Ruach HaKodesh," this act constitutes a lawful commissioning of the breath. It confers standing star decisis, a precedent-setting authorization, establishing the believer's right to stand as a duly recognized agent within the heavenly court system. This same act is mirrored in Genesis 2:7, when Yahuwah breathed life into Adam, giving him rightful standing before Yahweh. The Ruach is the active force of Yahuwah that empowers righteous judgment and renders final verdict, life or death. This same executive power is given to the assembly. John chapter 20:23 says, "By the power of the Ruach, sins are either remitted or retained unto the great judgment." Executive power is that which gives the law its enforceability. Upon breach, it transforms the law from mere command into something punitive and punishable. Without the Ruach, the law lacks executive force. It remains merely the lex scripta, the written letter, void of living power and dependent upon fallible human agency for enforcement. Only through the Ruach does the law move from dead statute to active injunction. Paul calls the Torah the letter that kills when divorced from the Ruach. The written law on stone or parchment by itself cannot execute itself. It declares but does not empower. An injunction is not a passive command, "You shall or shall not." It is a binding, enforceable order. When Yahuwah's commandments are tethered to the executive power of the Ruach HaKodesh, his word ceases to be static code and becomes a living instrument carried out in the life of the believer. Romans 8:2-4 makes the case. The law of the Spirit of life in Yahusha HaMashiach has set you free, so that the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. In Yahusha, we are loosed from the law of sin and death and bound to the law of righteousness, wherein there is liberty. The Ruach executes the judicial verdict according to the work of salvation, determining whether our faith stands active and alive or collapses into the dead works of unbelief. To remit sin is to release one from guilt, discharging the liability. To retain sin means the guilt remains in force until final judgment. This is executive power, like a governor's ability to pardon. Unlike judicial authority, which interprets the law, executive power enforces judgment or extends mercy. The Sanhedrin and Rome administered man's justice, a system inherently corrupted by human reasoning. Their judgment was perverted by false witnesses like those who accused Yahusha. Likewise, they purchased men like Judas to serve their corruption. Yahusha gives the judicial mark of his name and the executive seal of the Spirit to ensure his assembly does not replicate this evil. Now, the apostolic commission is to go forth to the nations and testify to the salvation accomplished in Yahusha. That is to preach the good news that sin has been remitted. It is the same executive power of the Ruach that raised Yahusha from the dead, demonstrating dominion over both life and death. In Acts 1:8, he says, "And you shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. To those who hear the word of salvation, their sins are remitted, and they shall be saved. To those who reject the word, their sins are retained unto greater judgment." Without the Ruach, the authority would be fleshly presumption, but by the Ruach, the assembly acts under the authority of Yahusha's name. Decisions that line up with heaven are ratified by the Ruach because the Ruach is the seal. The delegate, apostle, elder, members of the assembly, does not act on their own merit, but executes the king's will on earth that all shall be saved. The Ruach is the means by which executive power is delegated. Yahusha is the principle of resurrection life. His disciples are agents, and the Ruach is the instrument of agency, the living seal that ensures their acts remain intra vires, within authority, and not ultra vires, beyond authority. This does not mean men get to decide ultimate salvation. It means that within the assembly of believers, the people have the judicial authority to interpret, apply, render, and impose the law of forgiveness through grace, mercy, and compassion. Those under the apostolic commission are given executive power to testify of Yahusha. They are witnesses who hold the message of salvation, life or death, to remit or retain. The Sanhedrin were bound to the traditions of men, and these traditions could only be upheld through the coercive force of man. Yahusha rebuked them, saying, "They bind heavy burdens hard to bear, and they lay them on men's shoulders, shutting the kingdom of heaven in people's faces." When commanded to obey such men, the apostles replied, "We must obey Yahuwah rather than man." Even Gamaliel warned the council, "If this plan of salvation is of men, it will fail. But if it is of Yahuwah, you cannot overthrow it." Their attempts to suppress Yahuwah's will only proved the futility of man's power against him. In Genesis, Yahuwah commands, "Do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day that you eat, you shall surely die." The phrase "do not eat" is the statutory command, converting the sanction into liability upon breach. "In the day that you eat, you shall die" is the penalty clause, showing us that it is sin that places a burden upon the law. Yahuwah's word holds command even over death itself. In John 19:11, Yahusha declares that Pilate's authority exists only to serve the will of Yahuwah. Yahusha makes a clear distinction between man's judicial power and Yahuwah's. Pilate held nothing except what was given to him from above. For the Imperium of Rome and all governments of men hold jurisdiction only over mortality, where sin exercises judicial authority and death enforces its verdicts with executive power. Nevertheless, sin and death are temporal, revocable, and confined to the grave. As Paul declares, "O death, where is your sting? O grave, where is your victory?" But thanks be to Yahuwah who gives us the victory through our master Yahusha. And in the end, death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire, proving the impotence of their power, while Yahuwah's jurisdiction governs eternal destiny. Human judgment, even at its most severe, extends only to the body. Man's imperium may kill flesh, but it cannot touch the soul. This aligns with Matthew 10:28. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. Yahuwah alone holds authority over both body and soul together, and only his tribunal can sentence to Gehenna, which is the final judgment beyond the grave of Sheol. Those who abide in the flesh are subject to the powers of this world, but those who abide in Yahusha through the Ruach are no longer under the reign of sin and death. In the Ruach, we become citizens of heaven, seated in heavenly places with Mashiach. After Yahusha's resurrection, he declared, all judicial authority and executive power, both in heaven and on earth, has been given unto me, establishing that heavenly exousia is superior to every other power. The governance of this present age may claim jurisdiction over the earthly body. However, it has no rightful authority over the life of those who are hidden in Yahusha. The Sanhedrin stood as the council of Satan, presuming over Yahusha the authority to render a final verdict, while Pilate stood as an executor of Satan's will. However, Yahuwah's judgment of Yahusha stood in complete contrast to the verdicts of the Sanhedrin and Rome. By his own judicial authority, Yahuwah declared Yahusha innocent, fulfilling the prophecy that he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. This was confirmed by the resurrection, for as Paul writes, he was declared to be the Son of Yahweh with power by the Spirit of righteousness through the resurrection from the dead. The Sanhedrin, by contrast, condemned Yahusha on a charge that relied on false witnesses and corrupted tradition. They themselves, being bound to sin, were unable to lift its burden. Shutting men out of the kingdom, they refused to enter. Rome's judgment was the temporal enforcement of death, the political sword of the empire. While the Sanhedrin's judgment was corrupt and Rome's judgment was coercive, Yahuwah's judgment was just, eternal, and vindicated by the executive power of the Ruach, who raised Yahusha to life and seated him at the right hand of glory. A final record of proceedings. Judgment against Yahusha of Nazareth. Upon presentation of the accused before the tribunal of Pontius Pilate, Roman governor of Judea, and after repeated declarations by the magistrate that he found no fault in the man, the presiding authority performed the act of hand-washing, disclaiming liability for the blood of the accused. At this declaration, the assembled body of priests, elders, and people, acting as a corporate plaintiff, did enter the following confession into the record. His blood be upon us and upon our children. Said confession constitutes a judicial self-imprecation by which the assembly and its posterity assumed liability for the sentence and the execution carried out by Roman authority. This declaration operates as a binding suretyship, transferring the responsibility for the judicial act from the Roman governor to the covenant people themselves, establishing both immediate and generational accountability for the blood of the condemned. Record of proceedings. An appeal before the assembly in Jerusalem, Acts 2. On the day of Pentecost, following the resurrection of Yahusha of Nazareth, the apostle Peter, acting as advocate and witness, stood before the people of Jerusalem and addressed the liability incurred by the prior confession. His blood be upon us and upon our children. Peter the advocate declared into evidence, this Yahusha, whom you have crucified, Elohim has raised up, and of that we are all witnesses. Therefore, let all the house of Israel know assuredly that Elohim has made him both master and savior. Upon hearing this testimony, the assembly was cut to the heart, acknowledging the weight of their juridical confession and asking, what shall we do? Peter the advocate entered the appeal, repent and be sanctified, every one of you, in the name of Yahusha HaMashiach, for the remission of sins, and you shall be entrusted with the gift of the Ruach HaKodesh, for the promise is for you and for your children, and for all who are afar off, as many as Yahweh or Elohim shall call. Thus the original curse of liability was judicially set aside by an offer of acquittal through repentance and faith, with remission secured by the very blood they had invoked against themselves. The appeal established precedent that the blood of Yahusha, once imputed as guilt, may by covenant be imputed as atonement, rendering the guilty justified and their children heirs of the promise.